Hi, I'm Hlengengcobe from the South African Medical Association.
Hi, my name is Sneh Nyoni, and I'm a social scientist in employee wellness.
Today we'll be talking about bullying in the workplace, and really we're looking at bullying in the context of healthcare workers in South Africa and of course anywhere else in the world. And we've brought in Sneh. She's an expert in work dynamics, and having worked in the spaces of industrial psychology and wellness and employee wellness, and she's here to really give us a breakdown of what really goes on in the workplace. Sneh, what is bullying?
So, workplace bullying, or do we just start off with bullying?
Let's start with whichever way.
Let's go with workplace bullying. So the official definition around workplace bullying is really the persistent negative habits that happen where individual is harassed, abused, or violated by fellow employees or individuals in the space, in the workspace.
So it's supposed to be persistent.
Absolutely. So we underline that word persistent. Abuse does happen once off. We do accept that. But then when we talk about workplace bullying and the definition around it, we then specifically look at the pattern. So we're looking at a pattern of habits.
And how does this impact an employee at work?
So in many ways, when we look at the individual, we look at them holistically. So we will look at their emotional well-being. We'll look at their mental health. We'll look at their physiological health as well and their social well-being. So there's so many aspects of an individual that can get affected by workplace bullying. So if we talk about mental health, for instance, we start to see things like depression, anxiety, panic attacks, mood disorders. And we look at social relationships and social dysfunction, then we can start to see a breakdown in interpersonal relationships with other human beings, fellow colleagues, or people in the home setting, in the outside of the workspace.
What are the different types of bullying that can happen in the workplace?
Sure, there's quite a lot, and we might not even be able to exhaust all of them, but we look at as basic, habits of harassment. We look at, abuse, nonverbal abuse and verbal abuse. We look at physical violence, physical abuse. We look at belittlement, discrimination. We talk of things of like humiliation as well. So there's different types and textures that you can start to see in the workspace.
Now, what predisposes individuals to being bullied at work?
We look at multiple causes, and there's complex interplay of different multiple factors. So the first one we look at is organizational culture. If the organizational culture and climate is one that tolerates and allows for this kind of behavior to persist, then you'll tend to see employees or employers not really engaging because it's almost allowed, right? We look at personality traits. The perpetrators in the workspace, they tend to be people who are insecure, who are narcissists or have narcissistic traits, and really just difficult personalities to deal with a lot of competitive traits as well. And then we look at power imbalances. Within hierarchical organizations, you tend to see supervisors, leaders, or people in leadership positions use or abuse their authority over subordinates. So you start to see all of that. And if the climate of the organization really tends to allow for hierarchies that use or abuse their power, then you'll tend to see that as one of the causes for workplace bullying. And then just high stress and workload. With high tension and high stress load in the workspace, there's a lot of uncertainty, and people tend to break down, and burnout really just drives and creates prime environment for a lot of workplace bullying as well.
So I suppose what this means is if an institution, say a hospital, has historically had employees, senior employees that bully juniors, then it means over time, as the juniors become seniors, they too get to bully their juniors, creating this vicious cycle.
So you're absolutely right there. Vicious cycles tend to exist over a period of time. They exist over prolonged periods of time, where individuals tend to learn, and learned behavior tends to be recycled. Right. So when we talk about culture, we talk about firstly a process where people have been victims themselves before, and they tend to go and then abuse their power once they're in leadership roles. But secondly, we also look at climate and culture in the sense that management really just notices that these things happen, but really doesn't speak up against it, or they don't take any significant action against it. So it's almost allowed. It's that analogy or that thinking of it's tolerated. It exists, we know about it, but nothing's being done about it.
Did I get you right when you said most of the bullies actually have a low self-esteem?
Absolutely. That's one of the characteristics you'll tend to identify with bullies. So personality traits, you look at narcissistic issues, you look at insecurities and low self-esteem, you look at a predisposed nature to control and abuse people, really just because you are out to get your way in the workspace. So that's where it comes from. But also, I must say that with the lack of awareness, I think in our cultures as well, some people tend not to be aware that they're doing or they're bullying or their behavior affects somebody negatively in the workspace. So without any awareness or sense of open communication or conversations like this happening in the workspace, people tend to not know that their behavior really affects the next person negatively.
How do I get to know that I'm being bullied? How do I recognize that, are there any signs? Are there any specific things, feelings that I have? Or
so there are multiple things that organizations can start to implement. First of all, the most important is raising awareness. So people know what workplace bullying is, what negative behaviors exist in the workspace. And that really consists of trainings. You need to have those workplace conduct trainings that people are aware of. That's the first initiative. And then creating policies and procedures that really speak to this. Right? Because it's one thing to know about it, but we need to have regulations within the workspace that tells us that if such a behavior or conduct exists, this is the exact procedure that we need to follow to nip it in the bud or to address it, right? And then thirdly, just to not just have those policies, but also just deliberately action them, right? It's a lot of workplaces have these policies, they exist, but they are not actioned. So it's deliberately actioning it as well. I think that's the most important thing. But also just having resources as well, things like employee wellness programs, they tend to be available for employees to use when these kinds of situations or scenarios come up. Internally and externally as well. So we look at mediation. So you need to rope in these kinds of things that do come up in order to address this. And that's just, I think, one of the things that we need to focus on as well. Promoting open communication, not just, having these discussions behind closed doors. If it needs to happen, let it happen in an open space where communication is allowed to happen in a safe manner. Yeah.
You mentioned something about diversity and inclusion. How does it fit into the issues of workplace bullying?
Okay, so in spaces, given our context and our history in South Africa and where we come from, our legacy, there's a lot that still needs to be worked on when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And that essentially, when we talk about the isms, we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about age, So all those things really need to come into play, and we need to foster environments that allow for different types of groups to exist in the workspace. So not just have men, for instance, dominating, for instance, the construction spaces, not just having, race, like white people perhaps dominating certain industries. So we need to have collaborative, approaches to having diversity and inclusion, because then that starts to limit the, potential possibility for things like workplace bullying to thrive.
What are the hints and tips that you could give to anyone who feels that they are being bullied? in the workplace?
So the most important thing is to keep a record, keep a file, basically. You want to have evidence to support you and to aid your process in going through the right channels when you decide to report this kind of behavior. So keep email records, have photographs of any kind of negative behavior that you've spotted and identified. Secondly, lean into the resources that are available. Firstly, your support system and your support structure. Talk about this stuff. I think because we live in societies and communities that don't allow for open interaction and communication, people tend to fear to speak up and to really just lean into the support. So I think that's important. But also just use the much more, legalized routes and legalized resources. Talk to your attorneys, and also just seek out counseling support as well, because it is a lot to deal with on your own.
Thank you for joining us today, Sina. Any parting thoughts?
I think this is such an important conversation to have, and it shouldn't just start and end in these kinds of spaces. These conversations need to go beyond, the dialogue that we're having into the boardrooms, into the meetings that really then start to shape the action that is taken, within the workspace to mitigate this kind of behavior.